starting off in ministry, we were invited to Texas to candidate at a church there just north of San Antonio. And the position was for assistant pastor, but basically it was going to be youth and music. And so the weekend that we were there, they spent the whole time, the church, getting to know us, taking us to dinner, asking us questions, really trying to figure out about us. And then we were, of course, doing the same with them. And Saturday evening, one of the men of the church, a leader of the church, a really nice man truly, took us downtown for some program. I want to say it was before Christmas time, and so it was some sort of Christmas program. Anyway, I knew after meeting him that while he was probably a Christian himself, my opinion was this man didn't have a lot of discernment, personal discernment. Now, I was only 26 years old, maybe 27, I think probably 26. So I'm not sure how much discernment I had at that time, much less how much discernment he had. So I say everything with that caveat that I was a young man myself. But regardless, one of the things that I remember about him, and my wife also remembers, is that he would point people off in the crowd. And, that guy works at the radio station. He's a believer. And that guy over there, that fella, he would tell me his occupation and say, he's a believer or she's a believer. And it seemed like everybody in the crowd was a Christian. Just about. And it got me to thinking, I wonder if this man really knows what it means to be a Christian, because after talking to some of these people he introduced us to, I didn't get the impression that they were really following Jesus Christ. There's kind of a thinking process that's gone on in a lot of people's minds that Christianized is really the same as being a Christian. And by the way, just to put the top on this, he connected being a Republican politically with being a Christian spiritually. I don't know where I heard it first, but I think there's a phrase that kind of goes along with this that's just popular in our culture. Maybe you've heard it before. It's the phrase, he's good people. That's the basic gist of this man's way of thinking. Now remember, I was only 26 or 27 years old, so it's possible that I misjudged him. But the way he talked and the way he acted, as I remember, fits well with this idea. You're a Christian if you're a good person. But that's really the most common form of unbelief, at least as it comes to Americans. It's this kind of moral deism. That is, you believe in God, you're somewhat moral, you must be a follower of Jesus. But this isn't the God of the Bible. It's not the gospel. It's not really being a follower of Jesus. I think most people like to think of themselves as good people. There aren't a lot of people who genuinely say, I'm a bad person. And I don't think it really has changed much over the centuries. I don't want to say that it's just something endemic to our culture or to our country or to our time. I think if you go back through the generations, you'll find people who would say that they believe they were generally good people. You see it in the Gospels in different times and throughout Scripture, people who say that they're good people. And as you think about that, I just want to ask you this question. Do you think Pilate thought he was a good person? You think he would say, he's good people? We know him as the wicked Roman prefect who sentenced Jesus to death. And because of the Bible's record of Pilate, our entire view of him is colored and skewed by this story. But I want us for a moment to really try to get inside Pilate's head and think like Pilate was thinking at the time. Now, his full name, as we know it today, was Marcus Pontius Pilate. He was the appointed ruler in Judea by Tiberius, and he served somewhere between 26 and 36 AD. His rule confirmed by an inscription, by the way, found in 1961 on a tablet now called Pilate's Stone. In the very start of his tenure in Judea, the Jews hated him. Because he was a Roman prefect, he was basically the supreme judge. He would sit down in what's called the pavement on a bema seat, a judgment seat, and he would declare judgment on people. And Philo, the historian, and Josephus, the Jewish historian, both depict Pilate as being cruel and unjust. And other depictions of Pilate include stubbornness and greed and abuse. He apparently hung banners around Jerusalem during his time that depicted the face of Caesar. And then he minted coins, also with his likeness, pushing a paganism onto the Jews, just infuriating them, because remember, they were following some Old Testament version of Judaism. And Luke even includes a story back in chapter 13 in verse 1 where Pilate had slaughtered some Galileans and mixed their blood with the sacrifices at the temple. So the Jews hated him. But what do you think Pilate thought about himself? If Pilate were here to stand up and say, wait a minute, you guys don't know me. This isn't fair. What do you think Pilate thinks? It's interesting, by the way, that when Matthew's gospel records this story, do you remember the one thing about the story that really stands out? At the end of the whole trial of Jesus, Pilate does something visible in front of all the people. He takes a basin and he sets it out in front of people with water in it. And then he takes a towel and he dips his hands down into the basin and he pulls his hands out and then he wipes it off with a towel and dries his hands and he says, I am declaring myself innocent of this man's blood. This isn't my decision. And Pilate's role in the death of Jesus is really interesting because I think this good man, as he probably thought of himself, judged Jesus unjustly and ultimately gave an unjust ruling. And he admits the ruling wasn't right, but he did it anyway. And in this story, I think we get a little glimpse of how good people react to the death of Jesus. So let's consider first that Pilate's unsaved mind was confronted with two mutually exclusive ideas. What are they? He has the Jewish leaders on one hand who are bombarding him with accusations about Jesus, all of which are political. I want you to look at the story here. Jesus is arrested and headed to Pilate. Luke is not giving us a blow-by-blow of the story. Actually, he's just kind of advancing his own narrative, so we don't get all of the different trials. I think there are 2 or 3 with the Jews and 2 or 3 others with the Romans. He's just kind of telling his own story. And the Jews are accusing Jesus of this political crime. Remember, that's not the crime that they found him guilty of at the end of chapter 22. In the end of chapter 22, the crime is blasphemy. But now we get to chapter 23, and what are they saying to Pilate? They're not saying blasphemy, because what would Pilate do if they said, hey, he's a blasphemer? He thinks he's God. Pilate would say the guy's nuts, and don't worry about it, and why are you bothering me on this important holiday and so many people in town? What really is going on here is the Jews come to Pilate, and they bring before Pilate a crime of a couple of things. I think the last of which is really the crime that they're accusing him of. He's setting himself up to be a king. That's the crime. That's the inscription Pilate's going to put over Jesus' head. And by the way, that's the inscription he's going to put on Jesus' tomb in Latin. I believe tradition says that this is the king of the Jews. But because he's being accused of being a king, there are 2 underlying charges. And what are they? Do you see them there? He is perverting the nation, and he's discouraging people from paying taxes. That is, he's leading people to follow a different way, maybe than the way the Romans would like the Jews to follow. And he's saying, you don't need to pay your taxes to Caesar. Now, both of those would be something you might come from a person who's setting himself up to be king. Can you kind of see how that might work? But on the other hand, while these thoughts are bombarding Pilate, on the other hand, Jesus is doing nothing that would lead Pilate to conclude that he's worthy of death. Pilate says to him, okay, are you the king of the Jews? You almost get this sense of where Pilate's caught in this, what we call a catch-22, a rock in a hard place. He says, all right, so are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus' answer isn't no. His answer is kind of, well, it is as you say, but just like he gave the answer to the Jews earlier, it's not really a definitive yes, because Jesus is basically saying you have no idea what you're talking about. And poor Pilate is kind of stuck in the middle here. Jesus says, okay, I am what you say I am. Now Luke leaves out some of the record of the trial. The conclusion here, though, in Pilate's mind is not guilty. You read the story in the other gospel writers, and there's more information given. But here we have the declaration here where he actually says he's not guilty. I find no fault in this man. He's innocent. And I would think that Pilate would know what an innocent man looks like, don't you think? I mean, this is the guy's job, is to put people on trial. He's a judge for a living. He has eyes and ears. And you think of what Pilate's going through. Here's the violent protest that Jesus is guilty. And by the way, interestingly enough here, after declaring him not guilty, we have in verse 5 a third accusation. He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all of Jewry, that is, all of the Jewish nation, beginning from Galilee to this place. So he's someone stirring up the people. He's fomenting insurrection. All of this is geared to try to get Pilate to react politically to what's happening with Jesus. But what are his eyes and ears telling him? What are his eyes and ears saying? Isaiah says he would be like a lamb led to the slaughter, like a sheep before his shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. Jesus is sitting quiet. He's sitting calm. Pilate says to him, I have the power to let you go. I could give you your life back. And Jesus says to him, you really have no power. It hasn't been given to you but from God. He's unlike any prisoner Pilate has ever seen before. Pilate's dealt with radicals before, and Jesus is no radical. And so here's Pilate left wondering what to do. I've got these two mutually exclusive ideas. And so he tries to wriggle off the hook, doesn't he? And we see here this second idea that Pilate, not knowing what to do, passes off responsibility of Jesus to Herod. Now Herod is responsible, at least in a legal sense, over Galilee. You know, in essence, Herod was the king of the Jews, at least in the sense of the way the Romans looked at him. And Pilate hears that Jesus is from Galilee. He asks, is this man Galilean? And verse 7, as soon as he knew that he belonged unto Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who is in Jerusalem. And why is Herod in Jerusalem? Because it's the Jewish Passover. It's the time for everybody who claims to be Jewish is in Jerusalem. And Pilate thinks Herod might actually be the one responsible over Jesus. Pilate's not responsible for Galilee, and so he realizes here's a way out. I think the man's not guilty. The Jews are angry at me and say he's probably guilty of these crimes, and I don't really know what to do. So I'm going to send him on to Herod, who just happens to be in town for the Passover. Do you know what Pilate would say at this point? What would an unbeliever say? I'm what? I'm lucky. I lucked out. This is so coincidental. This is unbelievable. Now remember who Herod is. He's a Hasmonean. He's an Edomite. He's really not Jewish at all, but his family line got kind of mixed into Judaism because of the Maccabean Wars that occurred a couple of hundred years earlier. And so here's this Hasmonean leader. He's an imposter to the Jewish crown. And he is having now to discern whether or not Jesus is who he says he is. Well, this only serves to bring Pilate and Herod together politically. It doesn't really fix Pilate's problem. If you look at verse 8 down through verse 12, Herod is so excited about Jesus because he'd been hoping for a long time to actually see a miracle. And that really makes me think of Herod now, again, as an unbeliever who probably thinks he's a good person. And this is on Herod's bucket list, if you put it in contemporary terms, right? I mean, go see the Grand Canyon, see Jesus perform a miracle, scratch that off. And here he is, and he's so excited because he's going to be entertained. And that's what he wants, entertainment. But when Jesus refuses to say anything, verse 9, he answered him nothing. He says, if I won't be entertained by you through miracle, I will be entertained by you through mockery. And so they mock him. And you notice the thing that Luke points out in verse 11. What did they put on Jesus? A what? A gorgeous robe. Why? Why are they going to put that on him? Because they're saying, oh, you're the king. Oh, You're the ruler of the Jews, right? And I really can't think of anything more blasphemous than Jesus on trial and Herod thinking that it's entertainment. And so he pokes fun at Jesus as being the king. And by the way, another gospel writer says that they gave Jesus a royal scepter, a reed, like a scepter in his hand, and then they took it from him and they beat him over the head with it. You think about what's going on here, and there's nothing positive going on, except at the end, in verse 12, we find that Luke says the only good that came out of it, if you're going to call it good, is that Herod and Pilate become friends, because they had been political foes up to this point. And so Herod sends Jesus back to Pilate. Well, what's Pilate going to do? He has these two mutually exclusive ideas that are bombarding him. Jesus is innocent. The Jews say he's guilty. I sent him to Herod, trying to foist responsibility onto Herod. That didn't work. And so now he's stuck having to make a decision. I've got to decide whether or not Jesus is guilty or not. And Pilate ultimately acquiesces to the mob who required Jesus to be crucified. His just decision was that Jesus was innocent. Let me tell you, you need to understand here what we're talking about. We're talking about a person who's on trial for his life, where the judge says, I believe you to be innocent, but the end result is execution. Can you get that through your mind, that that's actually what's going on in the story? It isn't like we experience in our American justice system that, though imperfect, far from perfect, I would say, in all likelihood, is the best system on the face of the earth. There really is an attempt, even by people who do not know Jesus as Savior. I would say probably most of the people in that system are not saved. But there really is an attempt to try to get it right in most cases. And are there examples of where they get it wrong? Absolutely. And are there examples of where people purposefully get it wrong? Absolutely. And are there examples of racism and other kinds of bias in that system? Absolutely. But I will still tell you that when you compare it to all the other systems, they're really trying to get it right. And I think when you look at what's going on here with Herod, or with Pilate rather, he's giving you his decision. Luke's recording it. Don't be confused. The government of Rome says he's innocent. And at the end of chapter 23, the person responsible for carrying out the execution, who's that? The what? The centurion? What's he going to say about Jesus? He's also innocent. Everybody involved with Rome is going to declare their opinion about Jesus in terms of whether he's guilty or innocent, and they're going to say, this is an innocent man. He's not guilty. And so Herod brings everybody, verse 13, he brings everybody together for his ruling. They all come together around him. He recounts the Jewish leaders' charges against Jesus in verse 14. You brought him to me, saying he perverts the people. Then he explains what he's done. It just reads like almost a legal document. All right, here's what you said. Now here's what I did. I examined him before you. I found no fault in him of the things you accused him. And then I sent him to Herod. And Herod found no fault in him, nothing worthy of death. That was Herod's opinion. Jesus isn't worthy of death. This is really astounding. When you really think about this, what should have been the result of this trial? Not guilty. In probably every other case, just about in Roman history, you have a man examined to this extent, the result would have been chastisement and release. But there's something else going on. Even as Pilate says not guilty and Herod says not guilty and not worthy of death, your accusations, he says to the Jews, are ringing hollow, and Jesus should not die, that he would be chastened, beaten in the Roman sense, which, by the way, was like nearly a death sentence anyway. That Jesus would be released according to the Jewish custom during their Passover feast. His sense of justice is overruled by something really important, because he's the one who turns Jesus over to them. Even though Pilate says he's innocent and makes that's his judicial ruling, Pilate is the one who turns Jesus over to them. It's overruled by his selfish desire for political power. So they cry out at once, verse 18, "Away with this man, release to us Barabbas." And I think in Pilate's mind that must have sounded so funny. Here's the guy who's absolutely positively guilty. And what's he been doing? Sedition, murder. Those aren't little crimes. Those are big crimes. This guy didn't shoplift from Walmart. He didn't steal a car like sometimes stupid teenagers do because their brains haven't kicked in yet. It's not like he had a little bit of drugs in his pocket. This guy is a hardened criminal. He's a really bad dude. And what happens here? They say, "Release that guy to us." Crucify Jesus. Look at verse 21. "But they cried, saying, 'Crucify him, crucify him.' And Pilate said to them the third time, 'Why? Why would I do this? What's my moral justification? What's the basis on which I'm going to hold him accountable? Why? What evil has Jesus done? You still haven't proven your case, prosecutors. You're still short. There's no evidence here. You're lacking.' But they were instant with loud voices. Pilate's looking at their eyes. He can see the spittle coming out of their mouth as they're screaming at him. And that really is what Luke is saying here. The text kind of, the way the King James writes it, it just seems so nice and friendly, But they're screaming in their anger, their rage. The veins popping out on their neck, they're flushed. And they're really angry. Crucify him. And the voices of the people and of the chief priests prevail, verse 23. And so Pilate says, okay. And by the way, that's when Matthew says, Pilate gets out the basin of water, washes his hands, say, "I'm innocent of this. This is on you guys." Which we know is just a coward's way out, right? And so he gives sentence that it would be required. He released unto them Barabbas. He gets to go free. And what do you think he's thinking as he's walking out of prison? How did this happen? This is the best day of my life. I was about to be beaten horribly and nailed to a cross, and now I'm free to go murder more people. Good news. But they delivered Jesus. He delivered Jesus to their will. He turns Jesus over and says, fine, Jesus is going to die. Now, you read a story like that, and you have to ask yourself some questions when you come to the end. What does this mean for us? And I think there are some applications we can draw out of this. As we try to put ourselves into Pilate's place, and we think how a good guy, good people, deal with the death of Jesus. And the very first thing I think we have to acknowledge is this fact that Jesus said more than once, and it really is true, and it bears repeating, and it demonstrated itself throughout church history, and it's this fact. The world hates Jesus. Let me just tell you something. We need to stop feeling so insulated in a culture, in a society that allows, with the Constitution that we have and the First Amendment that we have, the idea that it will always be thus, that we will always be protected from people who hate us. It's just not true. You look through church history, what we've experienced in our country for the last few hundred years is really unusual. And to think that it's just going to always be that way, I think is a little bit naive, don't you? The world hates Jesus. It's not like in 1776 when the entire world went to war and the colonies won because of the French and the Russians and the Dutch. And the colonies won, all of a sudden, well, it really is another 15 years before they have a constitution, and then they have to have all these amendments. What are they, 10 amendments that come out? It isn't like all of a sudden at that point we have religious liberty and it will always be that way. It's like God ushered in a new time. It's like the Magna Carta for Christians. You've got to realize It wasn't this way before then, and it won't be this way in the future. We are living in a blessed time. It really is a blessed time because the world hates Jesus. It's always hated Jesus, and it hates Jesus now. And if you're a follower of Jesus, really good people hate you. I don't want to resort to the Benedict option, this writer who came out a couple of years ago with this book basically saying we need to realize that we've lost the debate and we need to kind of just cloister ourselves off a little bit from society. I'm not saying that. I think we should be in society, but we just need to realize that the world hates Jesus and those who follow him. And we just need to realize that in our minds. And that good people who are going to look at themselves in the mirror every morning and say, I'm a good person, are going to hate you because you follow Jesus. I think the second thing we can realize is that just because something is true has no bearing on its outcome in this life. You can scream that something is true or something is false until you're blue in the face. Satan rules here. If you read the end of 1 John, John says that the culture is ruled by the devil. And so truth has no bearing on outcomes in this life. Injustice is a sign of the wicked being in power. Are things unfair? Absolutely. But it's not because God isn't watching. And I think that's the ultimate application for us, is that God rules over all. This drama between Jesus and the Jews and the Romans, this drama as it's playing out, ends in the worst possible outcome, doesn't it? Doesn't it? Or does it? I mean, on the one hand, we would say this is the worst possible outcome. Jesus dies. But is that really the worst possible outcome? Because that's what God had planned. That's what God desired. He wanted Jesus to die for our sins on the cross. And so I think ultimately we look at a story like this and we realize that good people, when confronted with Christianity, will turn against Christianity because that, in their sense, is what they should do for selfish reasons. But we know that God, even in those situations, is still ruling over everything. And there's no fear that we have or should have, wondering if God's still in control. I would say it this way. God is allowing the drama to play out because really what's going on with Jesus and the Romans and the Jews is really part of the long war between God and Satan. And God was allowing everything to work as he did for his purpose and to his glory. And so I say good people who aren't really good people will turn against Christ and against God. But we don't have to wring our hands and fret and worry because we know that in the end, God's still on his throne. Let's pray. Our Father,